right, good to see you tonight, and appreciate very much you being here. We have been studying through the book of 1 Corinthians for some time, and it'll be our purpose tonight to cover as much as we can, at least, to the first part of the 11th chapter of 1 Corinthians this evening. So we invite you to turn in your Bible and study with us as we go together looking at this section. Delighted that you're here, and certainly want to let you know that we do invite your questions. I'm not sure about the timing of this. I've been heartened by the fact that on previous lessons, some folks have told me, don't feel like you have to rush through, that we don't mind hearing some detail about the passages. That can be dangerous, telling a teacher that, but I think I know where it comes from, and I'll try not to abuse that confidence. But we do have a question box in the back. I think we label it something like sermon topics, but that'd be a good place if some question crosses your mind tonight to write down your question, put it in the box. I may ask you to put your initials on it only because if I have a question about the question, I know who to ask. I'm not keeping any records. I just would be glad to have your questions about that. And I'll promise you, even if I take some thoroughness with this, I will not get to everything that might be said about these verses. And I won't say some things I mean to say. And your question may remind me, I should have mentioned something about that, because there are plenty of good questions about this passage. But that way, if I do have to carry this over to next week, I can incorporate those questions in, and I'd be glad to have them. So, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1 begins with these words, "Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. And now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things, and keep the ordinances as I delivered them to you. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered, dishonoreth her head. For that is even all one as if she were shaven. For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, forasmuch as he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman. But all things of God. Judging yourselves, is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him? But if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. But if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God." If you've been around any length of time, and there may be some tonight who've never read the passage before, but for many of us, this is not new territory. And we are aware of the fact that there are different views, even among brethren, about this passage. And so I say that I'm not here tonight speaking for everybody in the congregation. I'm here trying to offer to you what I believe the passage to teach. And just like with every other part of 1 Corinthians, it is full of challenges. And I have tried to look at it anew, and I've tried to present what I believe to be the case. Where I come out, and the material that we'll present will advocate the idea that the passage is requiring a man not to wear something on his head when he prays or prophesies, and we'll talk about what that means. And the woman ought to wear something to cover her head when she does that. Now, there are those who would say, and I think I've heard this point made, I don't know if it's an objection, but it's a point, Now say, well, that's so. Why do so few people follow that? I travel a lot of places, they'll say, and I just hardly ever see a woman doing that. So the idea is that's a minority view that you hold, and why do so many people miss it if that's the truth? And of course, there are a couple of things that occur to us in response to that. In the first place, you notice that he mentions here that the women are covered in many cases as they travel. I don't know that there's a great number of men who would choose to be covered during the assembly, and this passage applies to both men and women, so that's interesting, isn't it? So not all of what I'm saying is in such a vast minority. Another thing might be that it's important to recognize that I think there's more than two views about this passage. I guess with every view, any view, there's always a right and a wrong. But you know, when you look at a woman and she may not be covered when she's in the assembly, there may be different reasons why she would choose to do that. In other words, some women might choose to be uncovered because they believe that this passage is just a part of an ancient custom that really doesn't apply to us today. That this was an ancient custom at Corinth, it was a local custom, and therefore it was necessary for these people to do these things, but it's not something God requires of people today. So that's their view. Well, that's one view of the passage. But somebody else might say, oh, no, it does apply, but it only applies with long hair. That's the only covering of the passage is long hair. Well, you know, that view is very different from the view I just mentioned, because one view says the passage really doesn't have an application today. It was for a circumstance that cannot be reduplicated or duplicated. And so another one would say, oh, no, it applies today. It just is not an artificial covering. It's just the idea of long hair is the woman's covering. Okay. And then somebody else may come along and say, no, both of you guys have missed it. All of you guys have missed it. This is a passage that was limited to those who had spiritual gifts and miraculous gifts. Prophets and prophetesses, and so because we don't have such gifts today. Then therefore, so now we're back on the other side where it doesn't apply, but for a very different reason. My point is simply, and there are other views that brethren have held, but as you think about these different views, they certainly don't all fit together, do they? And it just occurs to me that a fellow who believes, for example, that this is limited to spiritual gifts might say, well, you've got a minority view. I'd say, well, you probably do too, when you think about it. You know, because really his reason for acting as he does is not any more in the majority than the reason I have for doing what I do. But here's the point, and I think all of us would agree on this. In the end, we don't make decisions about what we're going to do based on how many folks go with one direction or another, do we? That's just not our heart. What we want to do is we want to read this passage and find out what it says and do it, whatever it is, whatever it asks, whatever it requires. And that's where we find our confidence. Not in how many folks might follow us or how many folks might not. I think in the larger sense, probably what we'd say is, you know, when you look at the religious world today, how many folks who claim to believe the Bible and would claim to be Christians would believe and teach that baptism is for remission of sins? Not the majority. There'd be a lot of them, but even among them, there'd be folks that don't know what baptism is. They believe in sprinkling, and they'd be over here sprinkling babies from some sin they don't have. And my point is, you know, you're going to find confusion on just about any issue. What we're looking for is, what you and I want to do is, what does the passage teach? And we want to do that whatever and wherever that leads us, whatever it requires. And so you have that spirit, I believe, and I do too. And with that, we'll try to look at this verse and let it teach us and instruct us. And we start off, and let me just make this one more point, and we will get into the lesson. You know, I don't know that I need to say this. We'll touch on this toward the end of these verses, because we have the word contention mentioned there. And, you know, I guess contention can be a part of that. I've been here a long time. We've taught this passage a number of times. I've never been mistreated about this verse. I hope nobody would say that I've ever mistreated them about it. Folks that I disagree with, I love, and I have great respect for. And so, that doesn't change, and I hope I don't have a contentious spirit. That would be a shame. I have been in some situations where I think I've seen that. I've read some material I think was ugly in attitude, but that's going to be condemned whatever view you take. But what we're looking to do is try to help each other. And I realize because, I've been trying to understand this verse for a number of years, maybe many you have too, and I can see in my own life changes that I've made in my understanding. That helps me to be patient with other people because I certainly need patience in this regard. And there are things that I've seen through the years and maybe I've grown, maybe I'm going the wrong way, but I can certainly see an evolution in some of my thinking. And I hope and pray that as people have been patient with me, I can be patient with them. This is an area where I don't think that it causes us not to be able to work or worship together or consider each other brethren. What I do with my head may disappoint you, it may not, but it's not going to keep you from worshiping God, nor you with yours. So with that spirit in mind, that we just, in the spirit of brotherhood, want to understand the passage better, I hope and pray that this effort will be a help and no hurt. So 1 Corinthians 11 verse 1 in our Bible reads, "Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ." And the truth is, I think most everybody recognizes this verse probably belongs with the thought of the last chapter. The Lord didn't divide the Bible into chapters and verses. Men did that, and sometimes they did a pretty poor job of it. And I think it's pretty obvious that the passage that we read recently, we were looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where Paul, at the end of that chapter, really going back through chapters 8 and 9 and 10, was emphasizing the need to sacrifice sometimes our liberties in order to help another brother spiritually, give none offense neither to the Jews or the Gentiles or the church of God, even as I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved, be followers of me, as I am of Christ. And who can deny that that was Christ's life? In Philippians chapter 2, here's Christ who thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but he made himself of no reputation, took upon him the form of a servant, made in the likeness of men. So Christ is the ultimate in selflessness. Paul had followed his example, and he would say, be followers of me as I am of Christ. And I think that is a good wrap-up of the thoughts in chapters 8, 9, and 10. But I think the thought we're looking at really probably begins in verse 2. "Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the ordinances as I deliver them to you." Keep the ordinances. What is an ordinance? Well, the word paradosis may be traditions in your Bible. It can be translated that way. And a tradition literally is the idea of something handed down. Now, that may be something handed down from men's wisdom. Jesus in Mark 7 and verse 8 references there, I think, the tradition of the elders. Clearly not something that came from God. And Jesus said, you put that up on the level of God's word, and that's evil. But it certainly can mean that which is handed down from God through inspired men. And I think that's what he's talking about here. It's the same way that Paul used it in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, for example, and verse 15. The same word paradosis is used here. "Therefore, brethren, stand fast and hold the traditions which ye have been taught, whether by word or our epistles." The tradition is not just human wisdom or human practice, but rather that which is handed down through the apostles by God. In chapter 3, I think, in verse 6, you have the same word used there. "We command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you withdraw yourselves from every brother that walks disorderly, and not after the tradition which you received of us." He's not talking there about human traditions. He's talking about that which comes through God. Divine practice, divinely authorized practice, I should say. And so I think that's what he's saying here. So what's he telling them? He's praising them for something, right? That's not common in 1 Corinthians, is it? There's a lot of criticism. But here, I want to praise you for something. If you're looking for what looks like not praise, just look down at verse 17. Verse 17, the next section says that he's talking about the Lord's Supper there. We read this morning before we took the supper, this instruction here. Now, in this I declare to you, brethren, I praise you not, that you come together not for the better, but for the worse. There were some things about their coming together that were really for the worse and not the better. I praise you not. And he has some sharp criticism for them about how they were handling the Lord's Supper. I take verse 2 to suggest that this subject was not something that they had erred on in any great way. He could praise them for receiving the instruction not given to us here in some other letter, in some other way, maybe while he was there with them. He had given them instruction about what they were to do, and he says, you have handled that well. But what I think Paul is doing, if I understand it, these verses, he's not rebuking them for not keeping the word he gave them, but he's giving them more information about why, and the meaning and the symbolism behind what he had commanded them to do that they were doing. Verse 3 continues, but I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is the man, the head of Christ is God. Now, he's going to talk about men being uncovered and women being covered and how they had been told that, seemed to be keeping that. But you need to understand that the connection here is that is symbolic of the respect for headship that you need to have. And so I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ. The head of the woman is the man. The head of Christ is God. The instructions given were founded on the principle of headship. In a specific sense, we understand that in God's arrangement, a wife has a husband as her head. A husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. That's Ephesians 5 in verse 22. In 1 Peter chapter 3, we find, we could read several verses along this line, but in 1 Peter 3 and verse 1, likewise you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they may without the word be won by the conversation of the wives. Let me just point out in passing, I realize that makes modern people who are just eaten up with the spirit of this world faint. But I would just ask them before they pass out, hey, you've been doing it the other way now for the last 40 years. How's it working? Because I'd say it's not working very well. You know, God in his arrangement gave us the family. And he gave us not a brutal taskmaster husband, but a husband who loves his wife as Christ loves the church, but a wife likewise who recognizes her husband the head, as the church is subject to Christ. And so that's a special kind of headship. But I would notice with you this, that here we don't have instruction limited to husbands and wives. There's a special kind of subjection that obviously a wife would have to her husband, to nobody else. So we don't deny that at all, but I don't think in this passage we are finding just instruction that relates to married people. Now, let me add, those who know more than about Greek than I do tell me, that the idea here of woman and man, the words that are used, could be used in other contexts of husband and wife. It depends on the context. But I think that the translations that do translate this, the head of the woman is the man, have got it right. I don't think he's limiting this to just a husband and a wife. I think there is also a general subjection. And in this context, again, we're not just talking about married people, specifically about a husband and his wife and vice versa. Look with me in the 11th chapter in verse 12. We'll get to this, I hope. But he writes there, for as the woman is of the man, even so also is the man by the woman. Well, that doesn't fit very well if you try to make that man husband and woman wife. Because he's not talking there about a woman somehow producing a husband. He's talking here about women and men and how they are, in God's plan, they are necessary for humanity. They both have a role here. Not just a husband and wife in this case, but men and women in a more general sense. I think the subjection he's talking about here is in line with what we read about in a passage like 1 Timothy chapter 2. In 1 Timothy 2 and verse 11, you remember that's where Paul writes, "Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was first formed, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. Notwithstanding, she shall be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith and charity and holiness with sobriety." Well, obviously, he does incorporate there the idea of the husband-wife roles. But I think when he talks there about how that he suffers not a woman to teach nor usurp authority over the man, we wouldn't read that and think, well, that just is talking about married women. If a woman's not married, she may teach and usurp authority over another man. No, I don't think that's at all the point. So there is a general subjection that God reads. That's why God has said, I don't want women to preach, to be elders, to rule in that shape. Their work is important, but it's in another realm. It's not in that realm because there's a general subjection of women to men. Whether they're married to them or not, that's a special kind of relationship. But there's a general subjection that Paul draws on, I think, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And before I go further, let me just offer this thought. There is no insult in that. There's no insult in being called to being subordinate to another any more than, again, look at our text, 1 Corinthians 11:3. "I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ." Is that an insult to a man because he's subject to Christ? Is it an insult to Christ because he's subject to God? No. Jesus would say, that I do all things that my Father gave me. My Father sent me. There's no dishonor in that, in his role. He's not intended to be ruling over his Father. That passage we'll, again, I hope, Lord willing, get to before I die over in 1 Corinthians 15. When we get there, another fascinating passage and one that's filled with all kinds of good questions. But in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 27, Paul there writes that the last enemy to be destroyed is death, verse 26, and verse 27 reads, for he hath put all things under his feet. And when he saith, all things are put under him, it is manifest that he is accepted, which did put all things under him. When God gave to his Son all power and authority, Paul says, obviously that doesn't mean he rules over his Father. It's he's accepted that gave the power. So is Christ dishonored by that? No. There is an order. There is an order of headship. And everyone fills his place and finds the glory that God intended for him or her to find. But this is fundamental. This is where he starts. And he's saying that what I've asked you to do when you come together and when you worship together with your head has a meaning that preaches a lesson about your acceptance of God's headship in a spiritual sense. Look in verses 4 and 5. Every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman that prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For that is even all one as if she were shaven. Several really interesting things to me as a student in this passage. And one of the things that I struggled with for a while was, well, let me start here. Talking about dishonoring. What does it mean to dishonor? Well, as you might imagine, it means to bring to shame, to confound, to bring some dishonor upon his head. A man who prays and prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. What does he mean by head? The word head can be used, as Mr. Strong points out, you know this, literally or figuratively. Christ is my head. That is true. It ought to be true. I have a physical head. Hard to miss. So what does he mean in this passage when he says there dishonors his head? I think generally speaking, people have said, well, what he means is that when you do a certain thing with your head, in this particular case, when a man prays or prophesies with his head covered, he dishonors his spiritual head. Well, he just said that Christ is the head of man. It's hard to miss that connection, isn't it? So I think that is certainly true. And Paul is explaining to them how that in God's eyes there is a connection here. Now, I might say, I don't really see how that works. I don't have to see how. I just have to know that that's the connection God makes, and that's the message that God wants sent. He wants us to understand. This is how he wants us to honor the role of headship. That Christ is the head of man, and to show that, I want you to uncover your head so that you do not dishonor your head. So in one sense, I think clearly there's a figurative aspect to the word head used here. But I think it's also true that our physical head is in this picture. If you look in verse 5, if she prays or prophesies with her head uncovered, she dishonors her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. Well, now we're talking about the physical head again, aren't we? But if it's a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. So as I read the verse, I think that the word head might be used in both senses here. That he's talking about how that we dishonor, on the one hand, our spiritual head, and the other, that we dishonor ourselves. If I pray or prophesy, to use the language of the passage, uncovered, then I would be dishonoring Christ and dishonoring me, myself, by doing what I'm doing. I think both may be seen in the context here. Let me continue, if I may, in this passage and look at some other aspects of these two verses that seem to just hold a lot of questions and meaning. Notice the fact that he says here, every man and every woman. I think that's significant too. Smarter folks than me have made this point before, but I don't believe he's just talking here about leaders. I don't think he's just talking about Corinthians. He's writing to the Corinthians, but I don't think he's talking just to them. I think he's talking to every man and every woman who engages in this worship. And so every man, every woman, praying or prophesying. Here we find a part of the conditions, the timing, the setting for this instruction. Man's going to have his head covered, or uncovered, I should say. The woman will cover her head. When? When is this regulation intended to be put into force? Well, part of the answer is in this expression, praying or prophesying. We know what prayer is, I trust. The definition given here by Strong simply is to pray to God, that is to supplicate, to worship. The root word here is a word which means to desire or to wish. My favorite description of prayer, I don't know if it's a definition, but I think it's helpful to me at least, is in Romans chapter 10 and verse 1. Remember, that's where Paul makes this point. He says, "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved." That's a great description to me of what is prayer. Prayer is expressing your heart's desire to God. That's in essence what prayer is. We don't always. Let me use the example also in 3 John when he's writing to Gaius. He says, "Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospereth." I think the same words used there, wish. That's my desire, my prayer, that you would prosper in health as you prosper in spiritual health. So we know what praying is. By the way, you don't have to lead to pray, do you? We prayed tonight. We had one brother lead us, but we all prayed, did we not? And so in prayer, as we gather together, prayer is something that all of us may do if our mind is right and our heart is right. So praying is something that we can and often do together, expressing our heart's desire to God. What about prophecy? What about prophecy? If I thought it was useful to you, I could give you, pages of definitions that people offer. But in essence, it seems to me, just as one Bible student, as I read them, maybe you can help me with this. Usually it comes back to a definition something like this, that prophecy is sometimes foretelling. Prophets we think of as people who see the future, or telling forth, speaking, teaching the word. But if not always, at least almost always, it seems to be, certainly with foretelling, and even the telling forth, seems to be under the prompting of divine revelation, or the claim, at least, of divine revelation, because the word prophecy is used of people who were false prophets, too. And clearly they didn't get it from God, but they claimed to get it from God. So, again, smarter folks than I am have tried to work with this question, and we'll look to them. But as a Bible student, and I think about this word prophecy and prophesying, I think that's what it means. I think it's sometimes foretelling, sometimes it's telling forth. But just about every time I can think about in those cases, even the telling forth, it has some connection with divine inspiration or the claim to divine inspiration. I'll notice with you the conjunction or here. Because as I mentioned, there are some whose view is that this passage is not relevant today because it goes back to the idea of the spiritual gifts and that age of spiritual gifts. And sometimes even I've got material I didn't bring and didn't think it'd be useful to bring, in which folks write about this passage taking that view, and they'll say, Paul said men praying and prophesying. He did not say that. He never said that. What he talked about was men and women praying or prophesying. And you can do one and not the other. You could do both, but this phrase doesn't demand that both be done. So I don't think that we can take this phrase without and dismiss the passage as relating to a past age without being quite careless about it. That at the very least, if a man understands the word prophesying as a spiritual gift, a miraculous gift that is no longer on the earth, you still have to deal fairly with the word praying there. I don't think you can dismiss this passage when he talks about praying or prophesying. I think it's quite dangerous, frankly, to be so quick to dismiss a passage because, as one brother wrote, we can't duplicate the assembly that might be involved here. Well, there are a lot of assemblies that I might not be able to duplicate that can teach me a great deal, don't you think? You know, when Paul came to Troas, he was an apostle sitting among those brethren. That's never happened to me. I've never been in an assembly where there was an inspired apostle of you. But I know that example teaches me something about the timing of the Lord's Supper, and you too. It's quite dangerous to me when you go over to chapter 14, which we hope to do soon, and you look in verse 34 when he talks there about the women speaking in the churches. But clearly there were, at that time, spiritual gifts that were among the Corinthians. Can we dismiss that? Some have. They just dismissed all of that. I think that's quite dangerous and I think misguided. So, the timing of the passage. Part of it is understood here as praying or prophesying. But I think there's another qualifier that might help me to understand the context of this instruction. If you would please give me a minute, think with me about this, and if I've missed it, you can help me. But I think another qualifier for this passage that might be instructive has to do with the word church, as used in verse 16. We'll get to verse 16, but I think because we're talking about the timing, it'd be good to mention this now. In verse 16, Paul said, if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. And as a student, you and I wonder, what does he mean by the churches of God? Modern speech translations read something like this. This is how all things are done in all of God's churches. What does he mean by churches, the practice of the churches? Well, it could be one of at least three ways. That I don't know of more than three ways in which God uses the word church in the Bible. We were just talking about this not too long ago, I think, so we'll briefly make this point. But, the word church is never, of course, used in the Bible for a building. It's always used of the people, the called out. But it is used in different senses. It's used in the universal sense. That print is impossibly small, but you know the passage in Matthew 16 and verse 18, upon this rock I will build my church. Jesus is not talking about anything less than all of his people, all of the called out, everywhere, wherever they may be in the world. Or in Acts chapter 2, the Lord added to the church daily, verse 47, those that should be saved. The Lord adds all the saved to his body. That's not just to one place. Now, there may have been just one church at that moment, because this is the beginning. But I don't think he's saying there that the Lord sets people in the local church as soon as they're saved. What he's saying there is that they're my people. We're baptized into Christ. That's another way of saying the same thing. It is the church universal. But he also uses the word in a local sense. We don't have to go far. If you flip back to the first chapter of 1 Corinthians, he writes this letter to the church of God which is at Corinth. That's exactly what it is. It's some of God's people, but the universal church is not a church made up of churches. It's made up of individuals. But then some of those individuals that live in a particular area come together and by God's instruction organize and work together as he has given the pattern. That's what this church claims to be. It claims to be a church that belongs to Christ. It's not the only one in the world. In this sense, there's only one church. I will build my church, singular. But there are churches, local, that might be scattered around wherever, and they work together according to God's instruction. They have their own organization, their own leadership, their own treasury, their own work. But it occurs to me, well, let me just make one more point. And then I think we have another sense in which the word is used. I think here in Corinthians is a great example of it. We have the idea of the church assembled. Let me read with you. If you have your Bible open, I'd ask you to turn to 1 Corinthians 14. We're going to put these on the chart here. But I'm just going to work backward. I'm going to go into 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 33. And again, we'll get to this passage shortly. It's a fascinating passage, 1 Corinthians 14. But there Paul writes, just to grab the passage from the air, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. Then he says in verse 34, let your women keep silence in the churches. It is not permitted to them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also says the law. Women keep silence in the churches. Now, let me ask you, in what sense is he using the term churches? Not the church universal. First of all, they're not plural churches universal, are they? Just one. There's just Christ people. So that wouldn't fit here. How about the church local? Is that what he's talking about? Women, as long as you're a member of the local church, you keep silent. I don't think so. That'd be hard to do. Now, that won't fit the context. It's not what he says. What he's talking about here is the church gathered, the church assembled. And I think we'll find that as we continue reading. Look back in verse 28. If there be no interpreter, let him keep silence in the church, and let him speak to himself and not to God. He's regulating the worship in the church. That is, when the church comes together to function as the church, the whole church. Verse 26. How is it then, brethren, when you come together? Every one of you hath a psalm, a doctrine, a tongue, a revelation, interpretation. Let all things be done unto edifying. Well, I think things ought to be done to edifying everywhere, but he's talking particularly about what happens when you come together. Look in verse 23. If therefore the whole church be come together in one place, it'd be possible for some of us, we don't have a large number here, but let's say 4 or 5 of us met at somebody's house, and then another 4 or 5 of us met at some other place and some other place. You don't have the church. Now, you have members of a local church, but you don't have the church meeting. But when the whole church has come together in one place, that's special. That's something different. That's not just any group of Christians. I used the illustration, I didn't put it on the chart, but we've used this many times before, and you're familiar with it, I hope, in Matthew chapter 18, when Jesus gives the instruction there about, how to deal with those who are out of turn, those who are have sinned against a brother. How should you deal with somebody in some matter where he has sinned against a brother privately? Well, verse 15 says, you go to him alone. Now, you're a member of the church universal, are you not? You may be a member of a local church. When you go to him, are you the church? No, I'm just Wes. Well, he doesn't hear you. Well, then what should you do? He says, then you take 2 or more with you, that at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word may be established. So now we got Wes and we've got Markel. And we'll put Rodney in this too. Is that the church? No. That's Wes and Rodney and Markel over there. We're Christians. We're there to do God's work. We love this fellow. We're trying to win him. But he said, if he won't hear them, then tell it to the church. And if he won't hear the church, let him be to thee. Now the church is involved, and the church is active. So now we have a local church, you see. And this local church is working. So just individual Christians are not the church. And in this case, what we have is that church that's come together to function as the church, the assembled church. And that's, I think, the context of this instruction. Back in verse 19, in the church I'd rather speak 5 words with my understanding, that my voice may teach others, than 10,000 words in an unknown tongue. Don't you be coming in here exercising these gifts not to edify, to show off, or whatever your purpose is. When you come together in the church, it needs to be done to edifying, and it needs to be done orderly. In verse 5, I would that you all spake with tongues, but rather that you prophesied. For greater is he that prophesieth than he that speaks with tongues, except he interpret, that the church may receive edifying. That the whole church come together would be edified by what happens. Now in chapter 13, of course, he has that great treatise on charity. But that's related to the passage, isn't it? Because, of course, he's saying if you have the charity, then you'll be treating your brethren right when you come together. And then chapter 12, you remember, is when he's talking about the various gifts and their function and purpose in the body. But then look with me, continuing on in chapter 11, as we call it. Look in verse 33, and a little different focus, but again, the church is in view. Wherefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, tarry for one another. And if any man hunger, let him eat at home, that you come not together unto condemnation. And the rest I'll set in order when I come. That's how he ends that thought, about them coming together. That's what we call the church assembled. In verse 22, what have you not houses to eat and drink in, or despise ye the church of God, and shame them that have not? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I praise you not. A little bit later in this chapter, he's talking about the church of God, when they came together to eat what should have been to eat the Lord's Supper. Look at verse 20. When you come together, therefore, to one place, it's not to eat the Lord's Supper. It ought to be. That's what you should be doing when you come together in the assembly, the church assembled. Look down in verse 18. First of all, when you come together in the church, I hear there be divisions among you, and I partly believe it. When you come together, you're divided. He's talking about here the assembly. Look at verse 17. Now this I declare unto you, brethren, that you come together not for the better, but for the worse. That's the church assembled. Now look at verse 16. He says, if any seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. And why would he say that? He would say that because he's instructing us on the context of these ordinances. That just like with the Lord's Supper, that these are things that relate to the assembly. And just like the women not being allowed to speak, they weren't forbidden to speak everywhere they were. They weren't forbidden to speak as long as they were members of a local church, but they were forbidden to speak when the whole church came together in one place. There's something special about the assembly, and I think that's exactly what he's talking about in these first 16 verses. It's instruction to the churches of God. Just like women are to be silent in the churches, women are to be covered in the churches, and men are to be uncovered in the churches of God. So when he talks about praying or prophesying, I do not believe that he has in mind just two acts. I know that he mentions that. You do notice that later on in the same context here, he'll say, is it comely for a woman to pray to God uncovered? Somewhere prophecy got dropped. No, they never were intended to be taken just for themselves in just two acts or just one act. But I think that they stand as a part for the whole, for everything going on when the church comes together. There's a formal term that folks who know more about language than I do use, metonymy. Maybe you've heard that term. It's defined this way, as a figure of speech in which a thing or a concept is called not by its own name, but rather by the name of something associated in meaning with that thing or concept. So you talk about Hollywood, and Hollywood may be a term used to describe a lot more than just a community. And I think that's true in the Scriptures. We could give a lot of examples. I'll give one that's been often used. In Matthew chapter 21 and verse 13, Jesus once famously said, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves," really quoting from Isaiah. Now, you and I know enough about the temple to know there was a lot more that went on in that temple than just prayer, but he called it a house of prayer. House of prayer described everything going on in the temple. It's a holy place where worship goes on, and you have demeaned it and you have defiled it. A little bit the same in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 8, where Paul there says that love never fails. But where there be prophecies, they shall fail. Where there be tongues, they shall cease. Where there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. He mentions three of the gifts. What about the rest of them? Will they continue? He doesn't mention them. He mentions these three, and they by metonymy stand for all the gifts. They were all temporary. They were all leading and pointing to something greater, something lasting. My point is that when I read this passage, I don't feel I have to make a decision about, how far do I stretch the word prophecy? And is this something that applies when I'm alone or something? I think that what you have in this passage is something public. It's a sign. And somebody might say, well, it's a sign to the angels. Perhaps the angels are involved here. We'll talk about verse 10, I hope, soon. But the idea is that this is something that can proclaim headship. And I think the context of it is in the churches of God. People say, well, why do you just think this applies to the assembly? That's the reason why I believe it applies to the assembly. And that's where I think this is setting. And so it's not just when a man prays. I think it's when we come together to worship together that a man ought to be uncovered, a woman ought to be covered in the churches of God. A woman ought not to speak in the churches of God. The Lord's Supper is in the setting of the churches of God. Well, I thought I'd get further than that. You've listened very kindly, and I appreciate that. And I want you to know, guys, I hope this is true about not just chapter 11, but chapter 14 and chapter 7 and chapter 1. I think it's dangerous for any of us to be a know-it-all and to think that we don't need to listen to questions, we don't need to consider something else. And I hope that's my spirit. But I'll offer this too, that as we go through this material, I don't mean to suggest for a moment that I can't be wrong, but I will say that I'm offering these things with a great deal of thought and prayer. And if I am wrong, I hope that you will do me the kindness of thinking and considering what I say and then helping me by pointing out, now this is where you missed it. Before you dismiss it, that you'll do that. For my sake and for your sake, that we'll do that. And we'll continue this at some point in time in the near future. And I thank you very much for your kind attention tonight. Okay. If you're here as one who is not a child of God, I think we've learned even in this lesson tonight that we owe everything to Him. It's through His creation, through His providence, through His glorious sacrifice, through His submission that we have hope. And so if you're here tonight and you desire to give your life to God, then why not tonight do that? Be baptized into Christ and put on Christ. Maybe as one who is a child of God, who's not been faithful to the Lord. Why not tonight make things right with Him? And if we can help you in any way, let us know how. Please, right now, while we stand, while we sing.